Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tailies, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Here, the world slows down for a while. The rain falls softly outside, and we listen to the small moments that often go unnoticed. Memories, letters, thoughts, and dreams. Each story you'll hear tonight is meant to bring calm to your mind and warmth to your heart. So find a cozy spot, let the rain keep you company, and allow your thoughts to drift with the sound. Now, let's begin tonight's story. It started the way all the best rains do, not with thunder, not with drama, but the softest hush. A sound like the sky had exhaled, long and low, and let the clouds spill themselves gently onto the roof. He could hear each drop landing, pattering against the old wooden shingles of the cabin. It was the kind of rain that didn't rush you. It asked nothing of you. It simply arrived and stayed a while. Inside, the light was dim. A small lamp in the corner cast a honey-colored glow that touched the books on the shelf, and the rim of the teacup steaming beside him. The room smelled of pine wood, chamomile, and a trace of old paper. A log snapped in the fireplace, sending a soft crackle through the stillness. He was wrapped in a thick, hand-knit blanket, tucked into the worn arms of an overstuffed chair that had become his favorite spot since he moved here. He didn't move much these days, not out of sadness. Exactly, but because stillness had become a kind of prayer, a way to let the world unfold without trying to hold it all together. His eyes followed the slow dance of rain down the window, where the outside blurred into strokes of green and gray. Trees swayed gently in the mist, like old souls breathing. The mug in his hands was warm. He took a slow sip, and the floral sweetness of chamomile settled on his tongue. He wasn't trying to fall asleep just yet. Nights like this weren't for sleep. They were for remembering, for letting the mind wander the way the rain wandered down the slope of the roof, tapping out patterns only it understood. He didn't always live like this. Just a year ago, his nights were filled with noise car alarms, footsteps overhead, the glow of phone screens and subway brakes. There had been a woman, too, someone with eyes that held whole cities and silences in equal measure. But he wasn't thinking about her. Not directly. Not tonight. He leaned his head back against the chair, closed his eyes, and listened. The rain was steady now, like fingers strumming softly on the cabin's bones. The wind brushed past the windows, moving the chimes outside into song. They whispered like old friends at the edge of sleep. He liked to think the cabin welcomed the rain, that after all these years, the wood had grown used to it, the way old houses learn to creak in certain ways, the way they seem to sigh when the weather shifts. It was almost like being held. That's what it felt like, sometimes, to sit here with the rain tapping above him, like being held by something ancient and kind. On the low table beside him, a small notebook lay open, its pages softly curled. He hadn't written in it today. He hadn't needed to. Some days were like that. The silence said enough. But the pen was there, uncapped, waiting, just in case the rain stirred a memory worth catching. The fire crackled again, louder this time, and a log shifted in the hearth. Shadows flickered across the wooden walls. He watched them move without thinking, letting his thoughts blur into the rhythm of the storm. Somewhere deeper in the forest, an owl called, long and low. He imagined it sitting on a wet branch, feathers ruffled, eyes wide and knowing. His breath slowed. The tea cooled. And still the rain came down, soft as breath, steady as time. In that moment, he wasn't healing. He wasn't moving forward. He wasn't thinking about where he'd been or where he might go next. He was simply here wrapped in a blanket, bathed in golden light, listening to the rain on the cabin roof. And it was enough. It hadn't always been his. The cabin, that is. He stumbled across it on a day when the sky looked like it might break open. but never quite did. He'd been driving with no direction, just a tangle of thoughts and an ache he couldn't name sitting behind his ribs. The road had narrowed into gravel, then softened into a path barely visible beneath the autumn leaves. That was when he saw it half hidden behind trees, roof slouched like an old hat, windows streaked with time. It didn't look like much at first. The porch sagged. Ivy curled around the sides like it had claimed the place for itself. But something about it pulled at him, the way a forgotten song might tug at memory. He got out of the car, walked up the steps that creaked beneath his weight, and pushed open the door. Dust danced in the filtered light. The air smelled like cedar and something sweet, maybe lavender, or maybe just the ghost of someone who once lived gently here. The furniture was simple. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf filled with books left behind. There was no power, no running water. And yet, it felt like a place that had been waiting for someone who needed to be quiet. Someone like him. He didn't move in right away. At first, he just returned on weekends. He brought boxes of candles, hand tools, jars of honey, a sleeping bag. He spent hours sweeping the floor, patching holes, learning which windows groaned when opened, which floorboards whispered secrets. The silence wasn't empty. It was rich, layered. He began to hear things he had forgotten how to listen for. The flap of a bird's wings, the breath of wind under the eaves, the way rain stitched the roof with its fingers. Over time, the place changed him. Or maybe it just revealed him, stripped away the layers he wore in the city. He no longer needed noise to feel alive. He didn't miss the buzz of constant messages, the glow of screens, the pressure to respond. The cabin had no need for urgency. It asked only for presence. He planted a small herb garden behind the cabin. Basil, mint, thyme. He hauled water from a nearby creek, his boots sinking into soft moss. He started to learn the language of the forest, not just the birdsong and rustle of leaves, but the rhythm of its breath. Morning mist lifting like steam from the earth. The way deer paused at the edge of the clearing, not startled, just curious. Inside, he kept the changes minimal. A fresh coat of paint on the door, linen curtains that swayed in the breeze, shelves lined with tea and journals. He didn't bring much with him, just a few sweaters, some books, and the kind of silence that follows heartbreak. He let the rest go. Things, expectations, the story he'd once imagined for his life. There were evenings when he'd sit on the porch and let the rain soak the ground around him. He'd sip tea and watch steam rise from the cup as fog wrapped around the trees. He didn't feel lonely. The forest didn't speak in words, but it had a presence that filled the space like music soft, surrounding, alive. Sometimes, he found objects tucked into corners of the cabin. A cracked teacup with a faded rose painted on it. A child's drawing folded between the pages of an old book. A wool scarf still smelling faintly of lilac. They weren't his, but they belonged here. And so, in time, did he dot the roof, once brittle and leaking, now held strong against the rain. He remembered the day he climbed up there, patching holes with tar and wood, hands blistered, face streaked with sweat. When the first storm came afterward, and no water crept in, he smiled to himself. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a shelter for his body, and for something deeper. Now, as rain fell steadily on that same roof, he thought about how this place had held him together without ever asking for anything in return. It had asked no questions. It hadn't judged his silences or the way he sometimes stared at the wall for hours. It simply gave him space to breathe. He glanced around the room now, the warm glow of the lamp catching on the grain of the wood. A photo of a mountain pinned to the wall. A stack of journals. A chipped mug with a smooth curve that fit perfectly in his palm. Everything here had a story, and none of them were loud. He had come here to escape. But what he found was something quieter than escape, something closer to belonging. Not in the way people talk about finding their place in the world, more like letting the world go and letting something softer settle in its place. Outside, the rain whispered against the cabin roof, steady and sure. The decision wasn't sudden. It rarely is, no matter how people like to tell it. The city didn't spit him out. It just wore him down, piece by piece, until one morning he realized he didn't want to hear another horn, or elevator ding, or conversation that floated in from behind thin apartment walls. He didn't want to bump shoulders with strangers who moved too fast to meet eyes. Mostly, he didn't want to feel like a stranger in his own skin. He remembered packing, the quiet kind of packing where you aren't quite sure what you'll need. There was no checklist, just a slow gathering of things that felt like him. A favorite sweater with the frame cuffs, the tea strainer shaped like a leaf, books whose pages had been thumbed through too many times to count, a small carved bird his mother gave him long ago, and the notebooks, always the notebooks, filled with half-thoughts and poems that never asked to be good, only honest. He didn't sell the apartment right away. He didn't say goodbye to anyone, either. There weren't many people left to say goodbye to. Time had a way of loosening ties he once thought would never fray. Friends had moved on, one by one, to cities brighter, faster, louder. And her she had drifted, not out of cruelty, but out of a silence that grew too large for two people to hold. The city itself had changed, too. Places he once loved were now luxury towers or closed storefronts. Even the sky seemed more distant, cut up by glass and wires. He remembered walking down 7th Street one last time, the street lamp flickering, a boy playing saxophone at the corner. The notes floated up into the night, thin and mournful. He dropped a few dollars in the case and nodded. The boy never looked up. He drove out of the city before dawn. There was something freeing about leaving when the world was still asleep. The streets were empty, wet from a light rain that had passed through the night. Traffic lights blinked on autopilot, casting red and green ghosts on the windshield. He didn't play music. He didn't need it. The silence was its own song. The road unwound ahead of him like a ribbon. City turned to suburb, suburb to highway, and eventually, pavement gave way to gravel, then to the soft, breathing hush of forest. With each passing mile, something loosened in his chest. It wasn't joy. Not yet. Just space, air, room for something to unfurl. He passed signs he didn't read, towns he didn't plan to remember. He stopped for gas at a roadside station, where the clerk looked up with tired eyes and nodded without a word. He bought a bag of trail mix and a thermos of black coffee. It was bitter and perfect by the time he reached the forest. The sun was already sinking behind a wall of evergreens. Shadows stretched across the road like fingers reaching home. He rolled down the window and let the scent of damp moss and pine flood the car. It smelled like something forgotten, something ancient and clean. The first night in the cabin was cold, not from weather, but from unfamiliarity. He built a fire that crackled more than it warmed. The bed creaked like it was surprised to be used again. Outside, an owl called into the dark. He lay awake listening, not afraid, just aware. Every sound was sharp. Every silence, sharper. He missed the city for exactly 5 minutes. Not a person, not a place. Just the idea that someone might be awake somewhere, doing something urgent. But that faded quickly. Here, nothing was urgent. Not even sleep. In the morning, he opened the door to mist hanging low over the clearing. A deer stood at the edge of the trees, watching him. Not startled, just curious. He raised a hand in greeting. The deer flicked its ears and disappeared into the fog. That's when he knew he wasn't going back. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't need to. The city would go on without him. And for the first time in a long while, he was okay with that Dot. It hadn't been a fight. That's what lingered most. Not shouting, not slamming doors, not even the sharp sting of betrayal. Just Dot, quiet. The kind of quiet that seeps into things unnoticed, like fog under a doorframe. You don't realize it's there until you feel the chill in your bones. They'd been sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of a mug she wasn't drinking from. The rain was falling outside then too, though not as gently as it did on the cabin roof. That rain had been impatient, tapping hard against the windows, demanding attention. She hadn't looked at him when she spoke. Her eyes stayed fixed on the mug, or maybe on something beyond it, something only she could see. "I don't think we're lost," she said softly. "I think we've just stopped walking." He remembered how he didn't respond right away, how the words landed between them like a feather, and yet somehow the weight of them knocked the breath out of him. She wasn't angry. That made it harder. Anger would have given him something to push against. This was different. This was surrender. He reached for her hand, not traumatically, just instinctively. Her fingers didn't pull away, but they didn't hold on either. That, he thought later, was the real goodbye. Not the one where someone leaves. The one where someone stays, but lets go. The days after blurred together. They still lived under the same roof for a while, orbiting each other like distant moons. Dinners became silent. Mornings were marked only by the sound of the coffee pot and the shuffle of slippers. Sometimes he caught her looking out the window, lips parted slightly like she was listening for something. He wondered then if she already heard the forest calling. If it called to her the way it eventually called to him, he never asked her to stay. And she never asked him to follow. They both knew love wasn't supposed to feel like obligation. It was supposed to feel like returning. And somewhere along the line, they had stopped being each other's home. The last thing she said to him, really said, came on a morning like any other. She was standing in the doorway, her suitcase by her side, already zipped. He hadn't known she was leaving that day. Or maybe he had. In the quiet way, people know things without letting themselves believe them. She looked at him, not with sadness, not even with regret, just stillness. "Take care of the quiet in you," she said. "It's the best part." And then she was gone. He replayed those words often in the cabin, especially on nights like this, when the rain pulled memory from the corners. He would whisper them aloud sometimes, not because he needed to remember, but because they sounded truer than anything else anyone had ever said to him. Take care of the quiet in you. At first, he didn't understand. In the city, quiet was rare. It was something you stole in fragments, a few minutes before the world woke up, a subway ride without a stranger's music leaking from headphones. But here, in the forest, quiet wasn't something he needed to steal. It was something he had to learn how to live with. He learned it slowly. Learned that quiet isn't emptiness. It's not silence in the absence of sound. It's presence. It's the space where your thoughts unspool without fear, where memory can stretch out and settle like dust in sunlight. He started to notice things he never had time for before. The way the rain changes, pitch depending on the roof's angle. The tiny knocks squirrels make in the trees. The flicker of a candle flame when he breathes too close. These weren't distractions. They were details. They were life, spoken in a language he was only just starting to understand. And through all of it, her voice stayed with him. Not haunting, not aching, just echoing. Like the last note of a song long after it's ended. He didn't write to her. He thought about it. Sat down once or twice with pen in hand. But each time, the page stayed empty. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because some things, once spoken, don't need repeating. They just need to be lived. Tonight, with the rain soft on the roof and the fire humming low. He let that memory rest beside him like an old friend. He didn't run from it, didn't try to change it. Just let it be what it was. A moment, a truth, a turning point. Outside, the forest sighed. Inside, he exhaled dot in the beginning. The stillness felt foreign. Not uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar, like walking into a room where the clock had stopped ticking. It was the kind of quiet that had a shape, a presence. He found himself listening for noise that never came. No footsteps above, no subway rumble beneath, no hum of a neighbor's TV bleeding through thin walls. Just the fire, the trees, the breath in his own lungs. He wasn't sure what to do with so much stillness. At first, he filled it, rearranged the bookshelves 3 times, took long walks, marking trails in the soft earth with stones and sticks, cooked elaborate meals he barely tasted, rearranged again, anything to prove that he was here, that time was moving. But the forest had its own clock. Days unfolded like petals. Slowly, softly, the sun came in through the east window in the morning and left through the west window in the evening. The trees didn't rush. Neither did the birds. Even the rain, when it came, didn't hurry dot. So eventually, he stopped hurrying 2 dot mornings became rituals. He'd wake to the faint sound of rain or wind or nothing at all. Stretch under the weight of thick blankets and shuffle to the stove to boil water for tea. Sometimes it was chamomile, sometimes lemon balm, sometimes just plain hot water with honey. He drank it slowly, watching steam rise and catch the morning light. The fire became his companion. It had a personality. Some days it crackled with energy, leaping like it had something to prove. Other days it sulked, stubborn and smoky. He learned to coax it gently, to listen to the way wood spoke when it caught flame. He began to read again. Not the kind of reading you do to fill time, but the kind that unfolds something in you. Old books with underlined passages, corners folded long ago by someone else's fingers. He'd sit in the armchair, blanket across his knees, a candle flickering nearby, and lose whole hours in pages where nothing exploded. Nothing shouted, just people living quietly. With all their ordinary beauty, the forest was never truly still. It just moved differently. He noticed how wind played with the pine needles, how crows conversed across the canopy, how squirrels darted with a kind of urgent joy. He watched the same pair of foxes pass by every few evenings, their rust-colored fur like fire weaving through the trees. He never tried to get close. He understood that some things are best admired from a respectful distance dot at night. The stillness deepened. There was no glow from streetlights, no distant sirens, just moonlight on the floorboards and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. He would sit by the window and watch the sky, stars dripping through the darkness like quiet truths. Sometimes he talked aloud, not to anyone in particular, just to himself, or maybe to the trees. His voice sounded different here, softer, less guarded. He wrote, too, not stories or poems, just thoughts, impressions, things he noticed. He wrote about the way the moss crept up the side of the porch, about the sound of hail on the tin roof, about the moment a drop of rain traced a line down the glass and made him think of her thumb brushing his cheek. Nothing profound, just honest. Stillness became less like an absence and more like a friend who sat beside him and never asked for anything. It didn't demand he be productive. It didn't measure his worth in outcomes. It just let him be. On good days, on bad days, on days when he did nothing but stare at the fire and think of nothing at all dot. Sometimes he missed the old life, but not the noise, not the rush. Just the idea of being known, of someone remembering what he liked in his coffee, or how he hummed when he read. But even that ache softened in the stillness. It became something he could hold, like a smooth stone in his pocket. Not painful, just present now, as the rain fell like a lullaby on the roof above him. He realized the stillness no longer felt empty. It felt full of trees, of breath, of small golden moments that didn't need to be captured or shared, only lived. He shifted in the chair, pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, and let the stillness wrap itself around him once again. Like a pause in a song, you didn't want to end as it spoke without speaking. That was the first thing he noticed, once the noise of the city had faded far enough behind him. The forest had a way of saying things in rustles and creaks, in dappled light and changing wind. You couldn't rush your understanding of it. You had to sit still long enough for the meanings to arrive. He started with the trees. Tall, ancient pines that stood like quiet sentinels around the cabin. They groaned softly when the wind moved through them. A deep, slow sound that seemed more like a breath than a complaint. He began to distinguish their voices, the sharp flutter of birch leaves in the breeze, the low sway of oak branches heavy with rain. Each species spoke in its own cadence, and over time he could tell which were restless, which were still, which stood strong, and which bent easily. The forest floor had its own vocabulary. The soft squelch of mud after the rain, the brittle crunch of pine needles underfoot, the sudden hush when he stepped on moss. Even silence had nuance here, one kind before sunrise, another after snowfall, and yet another at dusk when the world seemed to pause between light and dark. Animals passed through, his days like passing thoughts, never lingering, but always meaningful. A squirrel scolding from the roof, a woodpecker drilling into a far tree like a ticking clock. Once he saw a red fox dart across the path, tail flashing like flame, and it felt like a blessing. Not a symbol, not a message, just a moment of wild grace brushing against his stillness. He learned to sit quietly on the porch, mug in hand, letting his senses do the listening. The forest didn't reveal itself to those who demanded, but to those who waited, to those who softened it, spoke in endless detail. A distant branch cracking meant a deer. A sudden flock of birds lifting meant a hawk. The scent of rain before it came, the thick sweetness of mushrooms after. He no longer needed music. The forest was a symphony if you listened closely enough. Rain tapping the leaves above, the distant trickle of the creek, the wind moving through branches like fingers through hair. Sometimes, at night, the owls would begin their calls low, haunting, rhythmic. He'd lie in bed with the window cracked, listening until sleep claimed him. One morning, he woke to fog so thick it felt like the forest had stepped closer. Everything was muffled, intimate. He made tea and stood barefoot on the porch, the mist curling around his legs like a shy animal. He whispered, "Thank you," without knowing why. It just felt right. That was the thing. He stopped needing reasons for things. He no longer searched for meaning in every sound or sign. He let the forest be what it was, and let himself be what he was. Not a puzzle to solve, just a presence among presences. Sometimes he thought about how strange it was. People lived their whole lives never knowing the shape of a crow's wing in flight, or the exact tone of rain falling on different leaves. That they hurried past trees without ever seeing how moss clung to bark like a memory. He'd been one of them once. Always late for something. Always full of lists. Now, his only list was the sky, the firewood, the quiet hum of his own thoughts. He didn't keep track of days. The moon did that for him. The forest did not care about calendars, and slowly, neither did he. There were lessons, too, though the forest didn't teach them directly. He learned that nothing blooms all the time, that rest isn't laziness, that things fall apart, rot, and return to earth not as endings, but beginnings, that some trees lean into storms and survive, while others break, and that neither is failure, only truth. He once saw a tree that had been struck by lightning, its bark blackened, its center hollowed out. And yet, it stood. Around the scar, new branches had grown, reaching toward the sun like forgiveness. He touched its trunk gently, whispered something he couldn't quite name, and walked away changed. The forest didn't just surround the cabin. It lived inside him now, in the way he breathed more slowly, in the way he noticed things, in the way his voice had grown quieter, as if shaped by the stillness he now understood. Tonight, as the rain tapped its quiet rhythm on the roof, he sat with his journal open, but didn't write. Instead, he listened. Outside, the forest spoke its soft language. And inside, he knew it had already taught him everything he needed to know. It was folded neatly, tucked between the pages of a book he hadn't opened in months, The Snow Leopard, one of those paperbacks with yellowing edges and sentences he had underlined years ago, but could no longer remember why. He found it by accident while looking for something else. The envelope had no address, just her name in the same handwriting he used for shopping lists and journal entries. No date, no stamp, only a memory waiting to be reread. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he let it sit beside his cup of tea as rain pressed gently against the windows. The fire was low, the sky soft gray that promised a long, patient evening. The cabin felt smaller, cozier, as if the forest itself had leaned in closer to listen. When he finally unfolded the letter, the paper crackled slightly, like it had been holding its breath. The words were his, though they felt distant, now written by someone with salt still in the wound, someone still aching in every sentence. The handwriting was steady, but the tone trembled. I don't know if I'll send this. I don't know if I should. Maybe it's just for me. Maybe I just need to speak or no one answers. He remembered the night he wrote those lines. It had been late, and the city was still a hum beneath his window. She had already gone, not with a bang, but a pause along soft quiet that never filled again. He had written by lamplight, not to beg, not to explain, just to say what hadn't been said. I miss the way you folded towels. I miss how your hair smelled like chamomile after a shower. I miss how you stood in the kitchen, barefoot and quiet, like you were listening to music I couldn't hear. There were no accusations, no anger, just small details strung together like beads, moments that had once seemed ordinary, now precious. He had written about the things they never said out loud, how both of them had grown afraid of silence, how they had mistaken distance for peace, how some nights, even while lying beside each other, they had felt miles apart. I think you were right to go. I just wish we'd said goodbye with more tenderness. He paused now, the letter soft in his hands, eyes scanning words that felt like echoes. He didn't feel sad. Not anymore. The ache had dulled into something like gratitude, a bruise that no longer hurt when touched. The rain deepened outside, tapping a little harder on the windows, as if agreeing. He placed the letter on the table, beside the candle, and stared at the handwriting again. It wasn't perfect. There were smudges, crossed out words, places where the ink faded, where the emotion must have pulled too hard. But it was honest, and that, he thought, was enough. He didn't need to send it. Maybe that had been the point all along. Some things are meant to be said, but not necessarily heard. Some truths are quiet offerings we make only to ourselves. He stood, stretched, and walked to the small shelf near the hearth where he kept his journals. Carefully, he placed the letter inside one of them, not hidden, but not on display either. Just there, waiting, like a seed pressed into earth. That night, he dreamed of a train station, not one he recognized, but filled with warm light and the sound of distant thunder. She was there, standing under a lamppost, holding a book with his name written on the spine. He didn't approach, didn't call out, just watched her smile at something unreadable in the sky, then vanish into the rain. He woke with tears in his eyes and peace in his chest. The letter remained where he placed it, unsent, unopened again, but not forgotten. Outside, the forest murmured, and the rain softened once more into a hush that wrapped around the cabin like a blanket. He breathed in, slow and full, and for the first time in a long while, he felt free. It came without warning, as summer storms often do in the forest. One moment the evening was still just a soft breeze teasing the leaves, a pale sky dimming toward blue-gray twilight. The next, thunder rolled low across the ridge. Like the voice of the mountain itself, it stirred awake. He had grown used to the quiet sounds of rain, a gentle drumming on the roof, a soft trickle down the window pane. But this was different. This was a storm with weight. He rose from the armchair and moved through the cabin slowly, closing the windows, securing the latches. The wind had picked up, sweeping pine needles across the porch and sending a faint chill into the room. The fire in the hearth hissed slightly, the flames swaying as if reacting to the storm's breath. Then came the crack-sharp, immediate, like a branch snapping close to the cabin. And with it, darkness. The power flickered once, then died, leaving him in the thick silence that follows sudden loss. He stood still for a moment, listening. The rain was now heavy, fast. It battered the roof and pelted the windows in a wild rhythm. In the distance, another low growl of thunder answered. He didn't move right away. There was something humbling in the dark, a kind of reverence that asked for stillness. Eventually, he reached for the small tin box near the bookshelf, where he kept matches and candles. With careful hands, he struck a match and lit the thick beeswax candle that lived in the center of the table. The flame sprang to life with a gentle glow, casting shadows that danced quietly on the wooden walls. He made no attempt to fix the outage, no urge to restore the lights, to break the moment. He simply returned to the chair, now lit only by flickering gold and the occasional flash of lightning outside. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, time slowed down. He sat there, wrapped in a blanket, the candle between his hands like a small sun. Shadows swayed gently around the room. The thunder rolled again, louder this time, but not frightening, just powerful. Honest Doc, he thought of her again, of the time they had once weathered a storm together in that old apartment, their windows rattling, laughter echoing off tile floors as they lit too many candles and made tea on a gas stove. They had huddled under blankets then, reading aloud from whatever book was closest. Voices rising above the rain. Now, in this forest, there was no one to read to but the trees. Still, he found himself speaking softly, to the flame, to himself, to whatever parts of her still lingered in the air. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore," he said aloud. "Not this kind." Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The candle barely trembled. He let his thoughts drift, carried on the storm like fallen leaves. He thought of all the versions of himself he had been. The boy who asked too many questions. The man who tried too hard to fix what didn't want fixing. The partner who forgot how to listen. He saw them all, not with judgment, but with quiet recognition. They were all part of the same story. Just pages he had turned. The candle burned steadily, its wax pooling at the base like melted time. At some point, the rain began to slow. The thunder moved farther off, retreating into the hills like a beast satisfied with its song. In its place, a hush settled over the forest's soft sacred, the kind of silence that follows deep understanding. He leaned back, eyes half closed, the candlelight brushing his cheek. He didn't want the power to return just yet. Didn't want the noise or the light or the buzz of anything man-made. This moment felt rare, earned. He reached for his journal and opened it to a blank page. But instead of writing, he simply sat there, watching the flame until it danced into blur, until his eyes grew heavy and his breath matched the rhythm of dripping ease. Later, when he climbed into bed with only the candle for company, he felt something shift inside him. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. That night, with the storm behind him and the world outside washed clean, he fell asleep to the sound of soft rain and the faint scent of beeswax. No dreams came, just rest, and that, he thought before slipping into sleep, was more than enough. It started with mint. Not the kind that came in tea bags or plastic containers from city shelves, but wild mint, soft and shy, growing near the edge of the creek just beyond the cabin. He'd found it one morning while following the sound of running water, his boots sinking slightly into damp moss, the air thick with dew and early sun. He leaned down, fingers brushing the small green leaves, and inhaled. The scent was sharp and sweet, almost startling in its freshness. He plucked a few stems, cradled them carefully in both hands like a secret, and carried them back to the cabin. That afternoon, he brewed them into tea. Just hot water and the mint, nothing else. He poured it into his mug, watched the pale green tint bloom slowly, and took a sip. It tasted like the forest had forgiven him. From that day on, tea became more than a habit. It became ritual, a quiet anchor to his days. He began learning the plants that grew around him, not just their names, but their personalities. Lemon balm, tender and calming. Chamomile, with its tiny golden hearts and sleepy scent. Wild thyme, bold and grounding. He spoke to them as he picked, whispering thanks, fingers gentle as if touching the pages of an old book. He dried leaves in small bundles, hanging them by twine near the window where the sun could reach them. His shelves slowly filled with glass jars and handwritten labels, the cabin slowly taking on the smell of old apothecaries and garden soil. Even in winter, when the plants slept, the dried herbs waited patiently, ready to warm his cup and somehow his heart. There was something sacred in the preparation. The way water boiled just before singing, the swirl of leaves as they steeped, the first tendrils of steam rising, curling, disappearing into the stillness of the room. He treated it all like ceremony, and in a way, it was. Some teas soothed him when the days felt heavy. Others stirred memories of her laughter on the balcony with a mug in hand, of summer evenings when the windows were open and everything felt possible. Some blends brought dreams that lingered even after waking, like soft footprints on the floor of his mind. One evening, after a long walk through drizzle and pine needles, he returned soaked and cold. Instead of lighting the fire right away, he made tea lavender and sage this time. He wrapped himself in a blanket and sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching rain slide down the glass. The warmth spread through his chest like light through water, and something shifted. He realized he hadn't felt alone in weeks. The plants had become part of him, not just in his cupboards or his tea, but in the way he moved, the way he noticed the world. He walked slower now, with eyes tuned to the ground and heart open to the small green miracles at his feet. He had begun to heal, leaf by leaf. One morning, he woke with a headache, a deep pulsing weight behind his eyes. The sky outside was heavy with mist, the kind that doesn't promise rain, only stays close and quiet. He stood slowly, made a tea of peppermint, yarrow, and a touch of honey. By the time he finished the second cup, the pain had softened, and he felt like himself again. But more than the aches, it was the grief that tea helped him carry. The long, invisible sadness that sometimes hovered even on the brightest mornings. There were blends he reserved for those days' blends that reminded him of warmth, of rootedness, of how breath could return to the body, like rain to dry soil. He never called it medicine. That felt too clinical, too sharp. He called it kindness. A kindness he offered himself each day, With both hands around a cup, he began writing the recipes in a small journal. Not just the ingredients, but the feelings they stirred. A tea for soft mornings. A tea for restless nights. A tea for the days he missed her and didn't want to be comforted. Only seemed Dot. Sometimes he imagined teaching someone else someday, someone who might sit across from him on the porch, asking questions about mint and lemon balm, laughing at the way he measured time by scent rather than spoon. He didn't long for it. He just left space for it, like an extra cup on the table. Tonight, as the rain fell gently, he brewed one of his favorite blends, lavender, mint, and a single clove. He lit a candle, wrapped himself in his thickest sweater, and let the steam carry the scent across the room. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, and in that moment, it felt like the forest itself was whispering back, "You're doing just fine." He found it by accident, tucked into the back of a book he didn't remember owning. The book had no dust jacket, its spine cracked, pages yellowed. It was the kind of book you pick up at a sidewalk sale and forget about. But there it was between two chapters thin, curled at the edges, and bent from years of being pressed flat. He recognized it instantly. They were standing beneath an umbrella, caught mid-laugh. She was wearing that wool sweater he always teased her about forest green, too big for her frame, sleeves that swallowed her hands. Her hair was damp from the drizzle, cheeks pink from the cold, and his own face, he barely recognized it. Younger, yes, but more than that. Open, unguarded, like someone who hadn't yet learned how quietly the world could break. The photo wasn't staged. It had been taken by a friend long ago during a weekend trip upstate. They had found an apple orchard just as the weather turned. Rain had begun to fall halfway through their walk, and they didn't bother to run. They stayed, boots sinking into the soft ground, arms brushing, the umbrella barely wide enough to cover both. He remembered how they had stopped at a small roadside diner afterward, sharing hot cider and a slice of pie. They'd sat near the window, watching raindrops race down the glass, betting on which would reach the bottom first. They had laughed so easily then. Everything had felt full. He stared at the photograph for a long time. Not with longing, at least, not the sharp kind. Just a gentle ache, the kind that comes when you stumble on a memory that has aged without you, that has lived quietly in some forgotten corner, waiting to be found. He traced the edges with his thumb and smiled. How strange it was. He thought how a single image could hold so much. A second caught in time, preserved like a pressed flower between pages. And yet, it wasn't just the moment. It was the scent of rain on wool, the sound of her laugh echoing against wet leaves, the warmth of cider shared between hands. He didn't frame it. That wasn't his way. Instead, he propped it on the windowsill for a while, where the light could reach it during the day, and the shadows could settle around it at night sometimes. When the rain fell just right soft and slanted, he would glance up from his tea and find the photo watching him back, and he would nod as if to say, "Yes, I remember to Dot it didn't make him sad." Not anymore. If anything, it reminded him of what was possible, how joy had once found him, even in the middle of a rainy orchard, under a too small umbrella. And if it had found him once, perhaps it would again. Perhaps not in the same form, not with the same face, but joy nonetheless. One evening, as dusk folded over the forest and the candlelight began its slow dance on the walls, he took the photograph down and slipped it into the back of his journal. Not hidden, but placed with care, like returning something borrowed to a friend. He didn't need to see it every day. He carried it now in other ways, in the way he noticed the smell of rain, in the way he laughed out loud when alone, in the way he left space beside him on the bench, not out of emptiness, but respect. That night, he dreamed of orchards and umbrellas, of wet wool and warm hands, of laughter so light it floated. He woke to rain. And without thinking, he whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular, just to the sky, the memory, the version of himself who once stood laughing in the rain, unaware that he was building something he'd someday need to remember. She came just after dawn, silent as breath. He had been sitting on the porch, mug cradled in his hands, watching mist lift slowly off the ground like a secret being revealed. The forest was hushed in that way. It always was at first light. No birdsong yet, no wind, just the soft stretch of the earth waking up. And then she appeared just beyond the edge of the trees. A doe, slender and alert, her coat dappled with morning light and dew. She stepped cautiously, her hooves barely making a sound against the fallen leaves. He didn't move, not even to sip his tea. He simply watched, barely breathing. She wasn't startled, not curious either, more like aware, as if she had always known he was there and had chosen to arrive anyway. She took a few steps forward, pausing every so often to lift her head and listen. Her ears flicked at unseen sounds, perhaps birds or distant rustling, or the beat of his own heart. He sat still, the warmth of the mug anchoring him to the moment. There was something about her presence that softened the air, made even the shadows seem gentle. She came again the next day. And the day after that. Never close enough to touch, never too far to forget, always in that space between wild and welcome. Over time, he began to expect her. He'd leave the porch door slightly open, his tea a little too hot to drink, just in case she arrived during that golden hour when the light slipped sideways through the trees. She never came at the same time, sometimes in the pink of dawn, sometimes when the sun was just tipping over the hill, once even at twilight, her body a faint silhouette among the birches. He never tried to feed her, never called out. He understood the boundary she carried with her, an invisible line that asked only for respect. She wasn't a pet, wasn't a sign, wasn't something to capture. She was a visitor, a presence, a mirror, in some quiet way, of how he moved through his own life. One morning, he found her standing at the edge of the clearing as rain began to fall. It wasn't a hard rain, just a light, steady mist that clung to leaves and lashes alike. She didn't retreat. She stood still, head slightly lowered, letting the water bead on her coat. He watched her through the soft veil of rain, a lump forming in his throat for reasons he couldn't name. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A man wrapped in quiet, a part of the landscape now, like the trees or the porch or the smoke curling from the chimney. Did she sense the sorrow that still lingered in the corners of his smile? Or had she come to offer something presence, peace, permission to simply be? He began writing about her in his journal. Small notes, brief sketches. She stood in the fog like she belonged to it. Her breath made little clouds in the cold air. I didn't feel alone today. He never named her. That felt wrong somehow, too possessive. She didn't belong to him. If anything, he belonged more to her, to the quiet she brought, to the hush that followed her departure. One day, she didn't come, nor the next. A week passed, then another. He told himself it was the season, that maybe she had moved deeper into the woods, that perhaps a fawn now followed her through the brush, soft-hoofed and uncertain. Still, he missed her, missed the way her stillness had taught him his own, but he didn't feel abandoned. That was the thing. Her absence didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a gift that had been gently returned to the forest, where it belonged. And so, he kept watch. Not out of hope or longing, but gratitude. Each morning, he stepped onto the porch with his tea, his eyes scanning the tree line, not for her exactly, but for the feeling she brought, the deep quiet, the shared breath between worlds. And sometimes, When the wind moved just right, or the leaves shifted in that familiar rhythm, he swore he could still feel her there, gone. Just gone quiet, it began quietly. Like most things do in the forest, one evening, after the fire had gone low and the rain tapped lightly on the windows, he sat at the table with his pen and a page he hadn't meant to fill. At first, he wrote without purpose, just idle thoughts, a way to pass the time. But as the ink curled into words, he realized he wasn't writing in his journal. He was writing to himself, not the man he was in that moment. The man before, the one who had stood at the edge of something ending and didn't know what came next. "You'll be okay," the letter began. "You won't believe that at first, and that's fine. Just keep walking. Even when the silence feels too big, even when you forget who you are in the mirror, keep walking." He didn't stop. That night he wrote for nearly an hour, words tumbling out like breath held too long. He wrote about fear, about softness, about learning how to let go without bitterness. He wrote about the small comforts that would find him in unexpected places, the warmth of a moat, the hush of snow, the way pine needles smell after rain. He signed it only, from the you who knows. The next morning, he folded the page and placed it in the wooden box where he kept old photographs and dried herbs. A few days later, he wrote another, this time addressed to the version of himself who would come after weeks, months, maybe even years down the line. The one who might someday forget the shape of this piece and need to be reminded. "Don't rush," he wrote. "You haven't missed anything. The world will still be here. The forest still knows your name." It became a practice. Not every day, not on a schedule, just when the moment called for it, after a walk, after a long silence, after a wave of missing something he couldn't name. He wrote to himself like he was writing to someone he loved, because over time, he had learned that was exactly what he needed. He kept the letters in a jar on the windowsill, each one folded and tied with a thread of twine. On rainy days, he would sometimes take one out, chosen at random, and read it aloud by candlelight. His own words, sent from a version of himself that had once needed to believe things would get better. And somehow, hearing them again, he always did. Some letters were long, filled with observations, how the fox had appeared at twilight, how the tea had tasted different with a pinch of sage, how the stars had gathered like secrets just beyond the treetops. Others were just a sentence or two. You're allowed to rest. Not. Every ache is asking to be fixed. The rain is not a problem to solve. He never wrote to impress. He never rewrote. The letters weren't meant to be perfect. They were meant to be true. It surprised him how much compassion he could offer to himself on the page, how easily the words came when there was no one to read them but the trees, the rain, and his own softer self. There had been a time when he would have dismissed such a habit too sentimental, too vulnerable. But now, vulnerability felt like a kind of strength, like standing barefoot in the forest, open to the weather. Once, he wrote a letter during a thunderstorm, the candle beside him flickering with every distant rumble. He wrote, "Even the loudest storms pass. You don't have to match their noise. You can be the quiet afterward." That letter stayed on the table for days. He didn't need to read it. Just knowing there was enough. Eventually, the jar filled. He started a second, then a third. But it was never about collecting. It was about listening to the version of himself who knew how to speak gently. Even when everything felt raw. Now, as the fire hummed behind him and the rain began again, he reached for his pen and a blank page. He didn't know yet what he would write. Only that something inside him had stirred. The same something that always did when the trees leaned in and the night fell quietly. He smiled, uncapped the pen, and began, "Dear you. There came a point, he couldn't say exactly when the rain began to feel personal. It no longer arrived as weather. It arrived as a companion. A quiet knock on the roof. A whispered invitation to pause. Some days it came as mist, wrapping the trees in a soft blur that made the world seem farther away. Other times it fell with weight, not harsh, but full, like someone pouring out all the things they'd kept inside. He started to notice how the rain changed depending on how he felt. On days when his chest felt heavy with memories, the sky seemed to echo it, sending slow, dragging drops that mirrored his breath. On days when his spirit lifted perhaps from a well-steeped tea or a particularly golden morning, the rain danced on the leaves like laughter. He knew it wasn't magic, not in the usual sense, but it felt like understanding, like recognition. It was the only thing, perhaps, that had stayed constant. People changed. Seasons shifted. His own heart had been shaped and reshaped by solitude. But the rain was always true. It didn't ask questions, didn't offer advice. It simply fell, again and again, like a gentle promise that nothing was ever really final. He began to speak to it, not aloud, not always, sometimes just in thought, as he sat by the window, watching it trace silver threads down the glass. Sometimes in songs low, humming tunes he made up as he went, syllables that meant nothing but carried a kind of longing. Other times he whispered to the rain before sleep, a quiet confession. I miss her today. I felt lonely today. I felt alive today, and somehow the rain always answered. Not with words, with presence. He noticed things no one had taught him. How the scent of the earth shifted just before the first drops fell. How puddles gathered in the same places year after year, as if the land had memories too. How the sound of rain on pine needles was different from the sound of rain on the cabin roof, or on the porch, or on the soft thatch of moss near the creek. He started to track it, not on a calendar, but in feeling. Today, the rain was thoughtful. Today, the rain wanted to be heard. Today, the rain asked for quiet. And then one morning, during a gentle shower that fell while he was chopping kindling, he looked up and smiled, not at the sky, but at the rain itself, and said, "You know me now, don't you?" It wasn't a question that needed answering. He began to write poems he didn't intend to share, all addressed to the rain. Some just a line or two. You came back when I did, didn't you? Some part of you remembers the way she cried, even when I'm quiet. You speak for me. These he tucked into the pages of books, between old recipe cards, inside the sleeves of records he no longer played. They weren't for finding. They were offerings. The rain never betrayed him, never arrived too soon or stayed too long. It respected the pace of things, the pace of healing, the pace of returning to oneself. On rare days, when the clouds cleared and the sky opened into blue, he didn't miss the rain, not exactly, but he waited for it, trusted it would return, trusted that, like him, it needed time to wander, to be alone, to gather itself before falling again. He believed, quietly and without proof, that the rain knew his name. Not the name on his driver's license, the name that pulsed beneath his ribs, the one that came only in stillness, the one he heard when he truly listened. Tonight, the rain returned after a long stretch of dry weather. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed it. As the first drops tapped against the windows, he opened the door, stepped outside barefoot, and stood beneath the porch awning. The world smelled like pine, and smoke, and rain. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes. Let it kiss his cheeks, curl into his hair. Let it say all the things he no longer had to say. He whispered, "Thank you." And the rain, in its own quiet way, whispered back. It didn't happen in a single moment. and he couldn't trace it to any particular day. But somewhere between the morning fogs and the slow-burning fires, the heavy rains, and the long cups of tea, he realized that he no longer felt alone. The cabin had become a kind of skin wood and warmth, silence and space. The forest had grown familiar, not mapped but known, and the quiet inside him, the one he had once feared would swallow him whole, now felt like home. It was a quiet that didn't echo. It didn't press against his ears or make him restless. It simply was, a gentle hum that lived beneath every movement. When he stirred the herbs in his tea, when he walked the path to the creek, when he stood barefoot in the grass and watched the mist curl around tree trunks, he no longer filled his days with tasks to avoid his thoughts. He let them come, not always comfortably, but without resistance. Memories would rise and fall her smile across a bookstore aisle, the soft sound of 2 mugs clinking on cold mornings, the way they used to make up stories about strangers on the street. He let those memories arrive and stay as long as they needed, then watched them leave, as naturally as clouds drifting past the moon. The silence became a conversation. He found that he no longer needed to be seen by others to feel real. The birds knew him now. The moss beneath the porch steps knew his tread. The wind through the trees had learned the shape of his name. And that was enough. More than enough. One morning, after days of gentle rain, the sun broke through in soft golden streaks. He stepped outside with his tea and felt the warmth on his skin like a kind of benediction. Everything shimmered. Leaves still heavy with water, the grass bending low, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. He sat on the step and breath. That was the thing. He had learned how to breathe again, not the tight, anxious breaths of the city, not the shallow sighs of sleepwalk days, but full, deep, rooted breaths that pulled the forest into his lungs and let it settle there. The quiet inside him made room for everything. The grief that still visited like weather, the laughter that came in unexpected bursts, the still ache of missing without wanting back. It made space for the possibility of something new, not sought, not chased, just welcomed if and when it arrived. He thought of writing a letter, but not to anyone. Just to this place, to the trees, to the rain, to the man he had become here. Thank you for showing me I was never broken, only quiet and needing space to grow. He didn't send it. He folded the page and placed it under a small stone at the foot of the porch. Letting the earth keep it that evening, the fire crackled with steady warmth. The rain returned, as it always did, soft against the roof. He sat by the window, hands wrapped around his mug, watching the sky fade into gray dot, and in that gentle dimness, he felt it fully, the quiet inside. Not a void, not a lack. A fullness, a presence. Like the last note of a song that doesn't end, but simply becomes part of the air. He closed his eyes and let it fill him. Night came without ceremony. No fanfare, no bright farewell from the sun. Just the gradual folding of shadows into the corners of the room, the soft dimming of color until everything settled into blue and gold. Outside, the rain continued its steady descent, tapping out a rhythm on the roof that had long since become a lullaby. He stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long while, watching the darkness gather. The trees swayed gently, as if nodding off to sleep. The forest wasn't silent, not exactly. It was full of hush of soft, natural sounds that didn't disturb, but soothed. The wind breathing through pine needles, the occasional plunk of a drop falling from one branch to another. His own breath, slow and steady. Inside, the candle flickered low. He had no plans for the rest of the evening, no tasks to complete, nothing to tidy or mend. He'd written in his journal earlier a few quiet lines about the way the steam had curled from his tea, like smoke from a chimney. Nothing profound, just a detail he didn't want to forget. He turned off the lamp and moved toward the bed, the wooden floor creaking softly under his steps. The quilt was heavy and warm, with corners that curled and threads that frayed, but it was warm, and it smelled faintly of cedar and sun. He lay down slowly, the mattress shifting to welcome him. The pillow, cool against his cheek, held the shape of his head like it had known it for years. He didn't close the window. The rain needed to be heard tonight. For a long time, he simply listened, not for meaning, not for signs, just listened for the sake of listening. Each drop a note, a syllable, a pause. Together, they formed a story older than any he'd ever written. A story about returning, about remembering, about being soft in a world that sometimes asked for sharpness. His body relaxed by degrees, shoulders sinking, jaw unclenching, hands releasing the tension they didn't know they held. The quiet within him deepened, like water settling in a still lake. He thought of her not with sorrow, but with gentleness, like the echo of a favorite song, like a letter folded neatly and kept in a drawer. What they had was not undone, only finished, and from it, something else had grown. He thought of the cabin, of the first day he arrived, weary and unsure. He had come searching for quiet. What he found was peace, and not peace as the absence of noise. Peace as presence. Peace as standing still in the storm and realizing you are not lost. Peace as knowing you are enough, even in your solitude. He turned slightly, pulling the quilt up to his chin. The candle had gone out without him noticing. Only the rain remained, a steady companion, keeping watch through the night. He smiled, just a little, not because of anything grand, but because of this moment, this breath, this soft landing at the end of a long road. The world outside was soaked and still. He closed his eyes, and as the rain drummed gently above him, like fingers on a lullaby drum, he let go of the noise, of the names, of the need to hold anything more. The last thing he felt was warmth. Not the last thing he heard was peace.